continue on with some more conversation this morning. Thank you all for being here. Again, to many of you, welcome to Iowa. We have a lot of things going on. We have a wonderful week, and you all make it special by being here this week to celebrate some good things and challenge us with some other things that need to happen. So as we started off here with CAST, we got a marriage of a couple of great organizations that create some conversation and education and share what we do in agriculture. We start off with CAST, and for all of you that, I'm sure most of you are aware of the organization. If you're not, go to CAST website, engage, get some of their publications, be a member. This is very important to be able to be a part of. The other organization here this morning to set up this conversation is U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance. That's an organization of 80 farmer, rancher organizations and ag partners that have gone together to continue the same effort here, is communicate with the public, to share some dialogues. In fact, this would be a mini dialogue. Many times they have had 15 different food dialogues out there, conversations about agriculture, different topics. This will be on GMOs this morning. I attended one of their events, and I know there's some others here that did as well up in Ames within the last year or so, and a great event, conversation about biotechnology and some of the different ways that we raise products here. This is very important. Sometimes we in Iowa can feel like we're pretty agricultural. We get a lot of this stuff. Certainly we in the ag side do. I was in my combine yesterday. I'm feeling like I'm getting ag. And, some others that were watching rain outside their combines were feeling like they were very closely connected to the impact on their operations. I drove down last night from my farm, and there's something about people that are engaged in agriculture that I'd say travel different than some of the other folks. You know, 4 hours of driving, that's a long time. Now it's hundreds of farmsteads and lots of combines and fields and lots of great stuff happening. You see dryers running and other things happening. And to the opportunity to be able to engage the non-farming public in understanding a little bit more about what's happening out there is very important. We will harvest in Iowa more corn than all but 3 countries in the world. Only the U.S., China, and Brazil will harvest more corn than the state of Iowa. Only 4 countries will harvest more soybeans than the state of Iowa. That's the U.S., Brazil, Argentina, and China. We have a phenomenal livestock industry, great processing industry here. Agriculture is everywhere you look if you know what you're looking for. It's everywhere here, and yet we still have many folks in this state, certainly folks that impact the state outside this state, that need conversations like you'll hear this morning. And so I get the pleasure of introducing Mike. Where's Mike? Mike's in the middle here. Mike Pearson, great friend, professional moderator. He, as many of you have seen him, yeah, there you go, straighten out time. Professional moderator, you have seen him on Market to Market show. Many of you know some of his family as well, and they didn't have $80,000, but I tell you, he comes from great genetics in the communication business. And Mike is going to lead off this panel, and look forward to some good conversation. I think there may be some time for questions from some of you out there as well. So, Mike Pearson, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Darby. Really appreciate it. This is exciting. We are reorganizing the stage. It is a little small. We want to make sure everybody can see. And this is a big day. You know, when we stand here and we talk about genetically modified foods, we talk about the Green Revolution, we talk about what is shaping the world that we live in and how we're going to feed the people that Dr. Van Eenennaam mentioned in her presentation. The collection in this room, I think, has done a tremendous amount of good work in helping the American public, I think, to begin with, understand biotechnology. But as we stand here today, there's still a lot of work to be done. I think we see that on Twitter. Is everybody here on Twitter or Facebook? If you're not, you have so much more time in your day. But we see a lot of ignorance every single day in the media, on social media in particular, and in our day-to-day lives as we're talking to our friends and our family in some cases. So today, we'd like to talk about how the consumer perception of genetically modified foods sometimes, and some might say a lot of the time, outweighs the science behind genetically modified foods. So to that end, we have a wonderful panel with us today. We're going to start here with Julie Kenney. She and her family farm here in central Iowa. And Julie also is a volunteer with CommonGround, a program that helps connect farmers with consumers, in particular farm women with female consumers, by and large. And it's a great program, and you've been active in it for a while.
Yeah, I've been active in CommonGround for a little over a year. The program's been around for a while, and I think there's about 100 farm women who volunteer their time from across the country. And really, our goal as farmers with that program is to connect with other moms and people who are making the food purchasing decisions for their families. So we have a unique perspective in that we are farmers and we see what happens in farms, on our farms on a daily basis, but most people don't have that privilege. So we want to give them access to what we're doing and help answer their questions. So it's a great program. They've got a great website, findourcommonground.com, if you're interested in learning more about it. But I'm glad to be part of this program.
Thank you, Julie. And we have Dave Sutherland, who is an amateur activist. He's an artist, and he is a blogger. And you can find him at several blogs, but he's probably most known for the blog VeganGMO. And Dave's passion really is helping share the GMO story with the vegan consumer, which is one that is very active in food choices. They're committed to food. It's a valuable audience for Dave to reach. So Dave, thank you.
Yeah, I think the vegan GMO niche, for whatever reason, the vegan community, the culture is anti-GMO by default. When I was an anti-GMO activist myself when I got involved with the vegan stuff. And as I learned more about science and critical thinking, I realized how wrong it was. And I have a passion for bringing truth to people. And so I know the vegan community very well. I know GMOs. And so I feel like this is my niche that I could help educate on.
Thank you, Dave. And next we've got Dr. Alison van Eenennaam, who you may recognize as the most recent recipient of the Borlaug Cast Communication Award. And so we've seen and heard Alison's presentation. She's very active. This is wonderful to be able to have her up on stage and get her thoughts, perhaps in a little bit more detail. So thank you, Alison.
You're welcome.
And at the far end, we've got Byrne, and Jay is the president, the founder of v-Fluence Communications. They specialize in strategic communication plans. So he works with a lot of folks in the food and ag industries. And we had a conversation last night at dinner. His knowledge base is tremendous. It really goes 3 miles deep. It's fascinating. So really looking forward to getting Dave's thoughts, particularly on the communication aspect. How do we reach consumers, and how have we done so far? So with that in mind, I'd like to thank our panel for joining us today. Should be a great discussion. As Secretary Northey mentioned, we would love to get your questions or comments. On the table in front of you are little cards. Please, if something we talk about sparks something, write down a question, hold it in the air a little bit. We have plenty of people who will come around and collect that, and we will go ahead and get some answers for you from our distinguished panel. So enough of the housekeeping. Let's get started. Now, Dr. Van Eenennaam, you mentioned that in the past couple of years, you have seen extension industry do a better job of trying to be a factor in the mediated reality that consumers are addressing. How do you think perception of GMOs has changed in the last 5 years as those groups have gotten more involved? Are we making any headway?
I'm not sure if any of you saw that recent, Jimmy Fallon was it, that did just a random sampling of consumers at, I think it was at a farmer's market, I'm not sure what state, asking them what they thought about GMOs, and almost invariably they were negatively predisposed towards them. And then he went a little deeper and said, why? I don't know, they're bad. And then he went a little deeper and said, well, what is a GMO? And he got almost every answer except genetically modified organism. And so I guess I would argue that we're doing a horrible job because there's a culture out there that's bad, not really sure what it is, not sure what it means, but it's bad. And so so that's the message that's got out there. And I would argue it's been subject to a spiral of silence by groups that are getting information out there. They're instantly, suggest that you've got some sort of implicit industry pay or an industry shill. You hear that all the time. And that's kind of trying to shut down that voice of science, saying, well, that's not what the data says. And so I think it's becoming actually increasingly political, to be honest with you. And so I think well, with the labelling discussion, of course, that's a really interesting one, and I think has raised the issue in many people's minds. And some of the No on 37 in California said, we may have lost this, but that really wasn't the point. The point was to raise this issue in the consumer's mind and make it an issue for them. And in that regard, I would say they've been successful. So that's kind of where I think we are. Not a very positive response, right?
No, but you raise an interesting issue. Who here on stage has been called an industry shill at some point? Who in the crowd has been called an industry shill at some point? A lot of them. So that's something we can relate to. Now, Jay, in all of your research on the internet, do you agree with Dr. Van Eenennaam? Do you think we're losing ground?
So we've been following these conversations for nearly 20 years now and seeing how they evolve, where they start. And the question that was asked is, how do you feel about GMOs, or what do you know about them? If you actually ask a different question, if you ask people, what do you care about? What do you care about in your day-to-day? What do you care about food? Things like that. GMOs don't show up. It's not necessarily present in theof their minds. Most of the surveys, people talk about, oh, I want safe, fresh, affordable, healthy foods for my families. You might find it in some markets, GMOs, usually down the bottom. But for the vast majority of people, it's not necessarily in their frame of mind. When it's presented, their current and initial reaction, because of all of the negative information that's out there, and because the information has been so presented in such polarized manners, they have a negative inkling, as they sort of expressed on that the late night talk show video. And unfortunately, more people get their news today from sources like Dr. Oz or The Daily Show, and they tend to sensationalize things. I would say, though, that the good news is for the scientists, for the folks working to bring these technologies out, is we actually have to go through this period. If we want the public to not oppose these technologies, people become aware of things and they become concerned about them if there's a risk. We've been telling the positive story about biotech for 20 years. People don't listen to the positive stories. They're busy. But you present a risk to someone and a concern, and all of a sudden they can go, oh, I might have to do something about this. And that is actually the opportunity. We have to intersect with that concern. A great example would be mad cow disease. Nobody was thinking about it in the US until it hit. And I don't want to compare mad cow, by the way, to plant biotech. I want to compare what people went through intellectually and processed. Just prior to the first mad cow was in the US, the public polling of the regulatory confidence, the public confidence in the safety of beef was at about 68%. People weren't thinking about it that much, and it was perfectly adequate and sufficient for the beef industry to sell their product. Mad cow disease, and there's covers of Time magazine, and people afraid that this could impact them. And of course, it devastated the beef industry in the UK. In the US, the cattle industry embraced it. They embraced the risk, they addressed it, and within a year, the public confidence in the safety of beef had risen to 86%. So often we try to avoid these concerns and fears. Someone says GMOs are going to cause cancer, whatever. First we want to explain how that's not true. But acknowledging that people might be concerned about that and jumping into the conversation is the opportunity. And doing it, I think we're doing it better with scientists. We're doing it better with farmers than we ever have before.
And now, you mentioned how people have concerns, and addressing those concerns is often a great way to begin to build that bridge. David, you've talked to a lot of people who come at this with a lot of concerns. They're coming at it as an ingrained belief. When you're working with the vegan consumer in particular, do you find that addressing those concerns up front helps you move forward to at least have a dialogue that's respectful?
Gosh, it's really hard to have a dialogue. Mostly what I see happening is similar to what Alison was saying about this spiral of do is address it or bring it up, and it kind of shuts the conversation down. They don't know enough to talk about it. So when I see anti-GMO sentiments being spread around, I just ask them, I engage them, say, hey, I think there's something we could talk about. They run away because their talking points only go so far. They don't know enough about it. It's a really deep issue, and so I haven't had a lot of meaningful dialogue about it because it doesn't get that far. I talk with scientists and advocates a lot, and that's a lot of fun, and I learned a lot from that. But throughout the vegan community, there's not a lot of dialogue. It's mostly just talking points we've heard, and they're spreading around.
Does it seem to be lessening as we look over this past 5-year period? Are you seeing more people come your way, or does the industry for vegan consumers still fairly consistent in their anti-GMO? A lot of it manifests as anti-Monsanto type mindset.
Well, like the Fallon piece, I think it was funny. I don't think it was representative or scientific, but I think it shows something that it was enough. GMOs are in the public consciousness enough that warranted that piece. What was the question?
In that regard, as you work with consumers, when you meet a vegan at a vegan fest and you say, I'm representing, or I'd like to talk to you about GMOs, last week's Chicago Vegan Fest, did you have any better response there than you think you would have 5 years ago?
I think a year ago, I was talking with Brian Scott, and I was at Monsanto with Janice Pearson, and we were talking about that very issue. Actually, we see like a decline in the, I think, in my circle, decline in the worries about GMOs.
Okay.
There are other vegans coming out now. They're afraid to talk about it before.
Sure.
I think more are learning about the issue, and they're coming around to being at least neutral GMOs, which is good.
It's a move in the right direction as far as science is concerned.
Yeah.
Now, just the language you used there, vegans are coming out. I mean, to come out in favor of GMOs in that community literally is, could be life-changing in some small way.
Yeah, Alison addressed that. There's a lot of stuff in her presentation that addressed that too. You don't want to be ostracized from the group. I got to the point in my vegan career where I didn't care. Truth is more important.
Okay.
And that's why I became vegan in the first place, I feel.
Sure.
The truth is, and integrity is of the utmost important. I want our argument to be the best they can be so we can make progress.
All right. Now, Julie, when you're talking to consumers, and I know you've hosted many families or farm women and bloggers at your farm, has the conversation changed over the last 5 years with the people you've worked with?
I think the conversation depends on where someone is at in the debate, what their level of awareness is, and what they've seen and heard about it. Certainly labeling has brought this issue up, towards the center of attention for people. But I don't see the conversation around GMOs all that different from trends that I'm seeing in society in general. I think people want transparency. I think there's a tendency to maybe not trust big companies, and there's a tendency to want to get information from people like them. So oftentimes when I'm having conversations with consumers, it's a mom one-on-one or a small group of them who are people just like me. So we end up talking about our kids, and we're talking about how we make decisions for our family, and inevitably the conversation about safety comes up. That's oftentimes their number one concern. They want to feel comforted that the food that they're feeding their kids is healthy and is safe. And that's when I share with them that I'm comforted in knowing that these are the most tested products on the market, and that's a big factor for me in feeding them to my kids. So for me, it's all about relating to them and really having a conversation and understanding where they individually are on the issue. For some it's just a low level of awareness, and some people are getting really close to forming a belief on it. So it kind of depends on the individual, and I think that's why it's important to engage in a real conversation rather than just spitting out talking points at them, which is sometimes tempting.
Yeah.
And for what Julie's talked about, Dave and Allison, often when Dave posts, you get a negative response, or you get that hashtag liar on yours, and I'm sure on your blog What you don't realize sometimes, though, is that these narrow conversations, for every 2 or 3 people that you're talking to and engaged with, sometimes in a confrontational style, there's thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of lurkers who are looking at this and seeing, oh, here's a reasonable scientist. Oh, here's a guy that he's gonna, this is not what I would expect. And maybe I'll listen to that. Or here's a farm mom. And that has a huge impact. And we have seen, particularly, when you present information in a factual, effective, and listening way using social media, that some of those negative memes don't spread beyond the core group of opponents. Look, there's going to be a certain percentage, this happens in politics too, on one far extreme and a certain percentage on the other far extreme. We're really working here on talking to the middle. And you'll find that people will pick up and they'll spread those scary stories. Oh my God, GMOs are causing cancer. God bless her, my mother sends me emails like that. Are you taking care of your kids? Because fear evokes a very specific response to us that we feel we need to do something with. And so we have to intersect with that, and that's, I think, what happens in these situations. Intersecting with it sort of stops it, and people go, oh, okay, I don't have to worry about this. Doesn't mean that they're going to come out and form a positive opinion about GMOs. It's unlikely. They're not going to come and hug us, the general public. But if the public decides, oh, this is not a big deal, it'll move along, and the technology will then be able to deliver its benefits, and we'll stop thinking about it. I know that's a hard message sometimes, but I tell that a lot of times to people who work on the crop protection side. Well, aren't pesticides wonderful? I'm like, if you work in the space and you know the great things they do, yeah, but the public, that message is never really going to be fully embraced by the public. And they don't want to. They want to move on with their day and not worry about things. And you need to help them move on with their day and not worry about it.
Yeah, I think I saw a scientist show, he was on I forgot what show it was, but a scientist went on talking about GMOs, scientists too, but they're showing a plant and how the BT was killing the insect of the plant and showing it as an example of how GMOs are great. And the panelists were just like, I don't want to eat that. It's killing the bug. It's going to be bad for me, right? So people don't understand pesticides and how beneficial they can be.
And that raises an interesting point. When we talk about GMOs, when we talk about it amongst ourselves, amongst industry, amongst academics, we know when we say GMO, we've got a very specific plant process in mind. Who do you think is defining GMO for Joe the consumer? I mean, have any of you looked into what they perceive when they read GMO, Dr. Kenney?
Yeah, well, I mean, GMO is, I don't think, the preferred term that the industry would have liked to have. It's kind of something we inherited from groups opposed to the technology. And as a geneticist, it's the most frustrating term ever, because what the heck does it mean? I would argue my dog is genetically modified relative to a wolf. He's a sheltie.
Yeah.
Let's face it. He's also a little strange, but he's not genetically engineered. And I understand that's a very subtle distinction for most people. And I think if you ask, I saw a survey where the consumer was opposed to hybrid cattle. So no more black baldies out there, guys. I think that there's many different genetic modifications we use, and there's really no clear understanding that specifically we're talking about genetically engineered rather than hybrids and all the other, quite frankly, rather amazing things we do in plant and animal breeding. And I think people's heads might explode if they knew all the stuff that we're not talking about when we're talking about genetically engineered, to be honest with you. But we'll leave that for another day.
Would it be worth, do you think, talking about what we've done just through conventional breeding to make people a little more accustomed to what we can do?
Have a look at that dairy cow graph I showed. I mean, that's a genetically modified organism, if ever there was one, relative to a 1950s animal. It just didn't happen to use genetic engineering. But I would argue that in order to select for that type of thing, you've made dramatic changes to the metabolism of that animal in order for it to be that productive. And yet, breeding has never been subject to regulations or labeling, or this was made from a selected cow. That's never happened. So I think that's a very hard point to differentiate, and it's going to become increasingly hard as some of the newer technologies come to pass, like gene editing and things. That's going to be not really recombinant DNA anymore. It's just I went in and made a little switch. Is that genetic engineering?
Mike, I think you raise a good point, and I think I think people tend to think of GMOs and modifying plants or species in general as something that's very new and unnatural, perhaps. And I was with a group of food bloggers last week, and we had lunch with Dr. Ruth McDonald from Iowa State, who, if you guys know Ruth, she is a phenomenal advocate for agriculture and for science in general. And these group of food bloggers, you know, were very skeptical of the technology, and she went down that path of explaining, you know, how farmers and geneticists have been messing with DNA and selecting for generations since the beginning of time. And it just was not registering with them. And finally she said, "Do you like broccoli?" And they all kind of looked at her and the light bulb went off, and she said, "You won't find it in nature." That's an example of how we have modified plants to get, you know, what we're looking for. So, you know, I think it's examples like that, really tangible examples that people can get their head around, that start to help ease their concern and move the conversation along.
And so it does, in that sense with the bloggers, it did ease their concern. Okay, we've been doing this conventionally, so this is just like the next step.
And perhaps a more precise way of doing what we've been doing for generations.
Okay.
So I think it helped ease some of their concerns, and it gave them a really tangible thing to get their head around.
So that might be a worthwhile avenue to pursue as we continue to have these discussions, especially as labeling becomes bigger, on how do we address the waste to the consumer. Now we've got a question here from the crowd, and it's one that, Jay, I know you've spent a lot of time researching. The question is, there are groups and organizations that have significant economic interest in discrediting and demonizing GMOs and the technology. How do we address that to gain the trust of the public?
Yeah, no, so it's a real challenge. One of the things we look at is, why are we even having a conversation about GMOs? People didn't just self-actualize. Oh, I'm worried about them modifying plants. You know, these are messages. There's advocacy groups out there and they have various agendas. But there's also, and they're quite large, by the way. We did a study for CBI in 2000, and it was 2009 data. We put it out in 2011, adding up the tax returns of all of the different advocacy groups involved in food and agriculture-related advocacy just in North America. And the amount of money that just these NGOs were spending trying to influence the public about how we should grow and produce foods, and people focusing on biotech, pesticides, animal agriculture, things like that. In North America alone, and these numbers were from 2009, $2.5 billion a year. Now, we're looking at those numbers today, and they're probably up because we're seeing a significant increase right now. In our 20 years of tracking, we're at the highest level of advocacy and campaigning, focusing on GMOs, focusing on pesticides, focusing on animal antibiotics, things like that we've seen in 20 years. And so, one, look at where does all this money come from? Well, the activists have donors and sources, but also there's a huge amount of marketing interest here. There's people that sell products that benefit from these food scares. And it's largely, and I want to be very careful how I present this, because it's not about organic producers, nor is it about organic consumers. It's how the marketers leverage the space in between. And we see organic marketers, and a good report just came out by a group called Academics Review, which analyzed their tactics, activities, what drives people to purchase their products, and growth in the space, and what drives people is fear. And fear around GMOs, pesticides, hormones, antibiotics, things like that. And so they're pumping in millions of dollars into the activist groups, they're pumping millions of dollars in their marketing. It's no wonder that Gary Hirshberg, the CEO of Stonyfield Organic, one of the largest organic dairy businesses in the world today, it's owned by Eenennaam Group, is leading the mandatory labeling charge. And you'll hear Gary Hirshberg on Dr. Oz, the same program that Alison was on, raising health questions and saying, you know, we just don't know. We don't know if they're safe. That has a direct impact on his bottom line. And, you know, if we were to address just using existing regulations about truthful, non-misleading marketing in all particulars, not just labels, but what they put on the web, what they put on their in-store displays, how they fund campaigns, and have people held accountable simply to that standard of we're not going to do anything that's not truthful or non-misleading, this would diminish significantly.
But we have these interests who are opposed to that. We don't see that action taking place from the FTC and so on. For the other panelists here, in your writing about GMOs, what groups have any groups opposed you directly? And you
Your perspective, we're wasting our time, frankly. So, you know, I think as farmers, I think we need to open our doors more often. I think we need to engage with people who are asking for more transparency and who are removed from the farm and want to know what we're doing on our farms. But I'm only going to do that with people who are interested in a dialogue and who want to have a conversation where we can learn from each other, because otherwise I think we're frankly wasting our time.
Now, in your conversations with bloggers from all across the country, did you hear any response after the Oz television program that Alison was on? Did anybody on this stage get a increase in questions about GMO? Did it spark something that any of you noticed?
Just to put this in time perspective, it was just before the Prop 37 labeling vote in California in 2012, and so I'm not just
right. So you were
a little bit of time perspective.
I think I was thinking it was last year, 2012. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, you know, very significant, but it's one in a number of things and a number of conversations about GMOs. So, you know, we're all busy and we're inundated with information on social media and the computer and Dr. Oz during the day, so I think it contributed to it. Personally, I didn't receive any direct questions from it.
Okay. Now we've got a question, and this one's interesting. As we come back to Julie, your comment earlier, we all have to be more effective communicators. We can't just let scientists carry the burden all the time. Here's a question. I like shopping at Costco. I hate hearing product demos where the products are promoted as non-GMO. What can I do to address this on a personal level? How do you address that in a store situation, or in a farmer's market situation, or in a face-to-face type situation? How do you address that concern? Is there a way to do it?
The demo people hate me at Costco.
Well, share your secret.
I think you kind of guess what might happen with me. Oh, here's a non-GMO pineapple. What? There's no GM pineapple. What are you talking about? Oh. I think that's socially awkward situations, but you know, that sells. And I know there's misleading advertising. I saw a non-GMO coffee the other day that said it didn't have any chemicals in it. Well, it better have some chemicals in it. It's caffeine, right? And I'm like, what the heck? So it's marketing again. It's back to the marketing, and I think that's where a lot of the problems come about. Is I get that might sell them more coffee, and so that's justifiable. And I mean, according to FDA labeling, it's misleading and illegal. But are you really going to go chase, you know, a caffeine-free or a chemical-free coffee label?
So I was at Target in the middle of suburbia, and the poor woman who was handing out samples, that was just her job, and she was carrying the message that she was told to carry. But I had my 2 kids in tow, and I very much looked like a suburban soccer mom, and so she asked me if I wanted a sample of, I don't even remember what it was, organic something, and I said, oh, tell me more, and she proceeded to tell me, well, you have to buy this because they don't use any pesticides, and it's so much better for you, and it, you know, she went down the whole laundry list of organic messaging, and I said, are you sure they don't use any pesticides? And, you know, I don't think that was fair of me to put her in that position, but what I was afraid of is that she was talking to the 10 other soccer moms right behind me and telling them the exact same thing. So I thought it was important at least to engage in a conversation with her and make sure that she understood what she was communicating, but you know, in terms of non-GMO marketing, I think it's an interesting question.
And it's probably going to be an issue we're going to be facing. Yes, David.
The whole vegan movement is kind of like it's a movement based on boycott, right? Not buying something. And I'm so conflicted. I still have those kind of proclivities of not buying something. You know, if I see something on the packaging I don't like, I'm not going to buy it. And like every vegan product has non-GMO on it, you know, non-GMO project. And if, you know, I want to not buy it, but then I'm just like, well, I want that, you know, veggie burger, whatever it is. So I have to like weigh my priorities. And I do know, you know, GMO scientists or you know, GM scientists that are just boycott that kind of thing. But for me, who was like kind of stuck in the middle, like all my products are like labeled non-GMO, and I hate that. But so I don't know. Yeah, what do you do?
I'm a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, exactly.
You just want to eat at the end of the day.
Right.
Yeah.
You have no choice.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now, we're talking a lot about labeling to sell, and particularly grocery store, you know, labeling, consumer labeling. that's had a pretty profound impact on how consumers view GMOs. We've seen that come into play over the last 5 to 7 years. By and large, does that GMO-free pineapple or the gluten-free Cheerios and everything else they've come to, has that been hurting the industry? Do you feel, the biotech industry? Jay?
Yes, because it costs money, it slows down processes, things like that. But what it really gets to is, it's probably actually hurting consumers. Look when Cheerios decided, oh, we're going to have GMO-free Cheerios. And I would say they actually did it in the best manner that you probably could. But when they came out with their new product, number one, it was smaller. Number two, in order to reformulate it and remove whatever GMO, it had a worse nutrition profile. It had fewer vitamins and the other elements that you look for on this. And then three, it didn't change sales. And what we find is, in order to get people to change their behaviors, it's these absence claims. Non-GMO creates a fear that that must mean and imply GMOs are bad. Pesticide-free, hormone-free, antibiotic-free. What?
Soy-free.
Soy-free, gluten-free. Even when there isn't a standard of presence to suggest, you can't say, oh, I'm selling fat-free asparagus. They won't let you do that because asparagus didn't have fat in it to begin with. But we've allowed that to happen with the GMO side. And we know that what motivates consumers to buy organic is not that organic seal. It's the absence of dangerous things that they come to fear. And that's what is taking place with the entire non-GMO movement. You put a non-GMO product next to a product that doesn't have that label, and people start to question. That must mean there's something wrong in this. They have no idea what the GMO is. But if they can afford it, maybe they'll make that extra purchase price.
I guess, having said that, there is that option through voluntary labeling in the marketplace now, and certainly with animal production, there's all sorts of, grass-fed, humane-raised, kosher, slaughtered. There's all sorts of options there for voluntary marketing that are in the marketplace, and it provides interested consumers with that choice.
Well, now that being said, we've got a great question here. As we look at labeling, particularly voluntary labeling, has anyone thought about creating a food label that is pro-GMO, entitling it something like, this food was created in support of human health and environmental sustainability? Would that have any legs? You're laughing, Alison, so I'm guessing no.
So the flavor saver tomato had a label on it. When it first came out, it was the first biotech product on the market, and it said, genetically, I forget exactly what it said, but it was labeled. And
last longer.
It was intended to be a consumer benefit product because the tomatoes were meant to last longer, and so there has been that concept. I think the term is so toxic now, and it's been so polluted that I think that would be a kind of a dangerous label. I did speak to someone who had, I thought, a good idea, which was to have a scannable, the box scan card codes, that would give you more information if you were interested in where the products came from within reason. I was in Vermont, and I was speaking on their labeling law, and they wanted events listed on the label. So the actual, what event the corn came from. So, I don't know, Monsanto 810 or Syngenta 250 on the label. And it's just like, oh my gosh, do you understand agriculture at all in terms of supply chain segregation and the way that crops are produced? It just kind of indicated to me a lack of understanding of basically how we produce food in shared distribution channels and the like. So it's kind of a concerning one, I think.
But the notion of a voluntary label for those who are seeking more information might be an acronym.
Yeah.
But that has to be truthful and non-misleading in all particulars. These campaigns demanding, a right to know. Most people don't know where our labeling system in this country was born from. And I'm guessing there's probably some people in this room that know who appointed the first chemist of the United States, with the precursor to the FDA, was Abraham Lincoln.
He's
and
come up
he did
a lot
so,
today.
Yeah. He's got some up on that internet.
Surprising.
But he did so in response to snake oil salesmen. People who were making false health claims, saying things that were in products that weren't. And that's the standard by which consumers in America are protected. And if we break away with a right to know versus consumer protection oriented around food labeling, then you can put anything that you have a right to know. I have a right to know if my product was produced using kosher methods. And therefore, you all have to pay the price of my right to know. Versus a voluntary method that also is truthful and non-misleading. It can't be disparaging. Things like that. And if you had that in the system, people wouldn't buy it. Because all the research shows consumers wouldn't be interested in that. They're not going to pay more for something if their products are equal, safe. They'll go for the cheaper product.
Okay. Julie, any thoughts on labeling as we look to the future? I mean, it is going to be not just voluntary labeling, but compulsory labeling laws. Have you received any questions during any of those voting periods about what GMOs were like from? What was the most common question?
The most common question related to labeling is what Jay has described as this right to know. And you know, the question I asked them back is, what do you want to know? You know, what is it specifically that you want to know? If it's that you want to know the ingredients, those are on there. If it's that you want to know the nutritional information, that's on there. If you want to know that the product that you're purchasing does not contain GMOs, then you can buy organic. There is already an option there. You know, I think we have a risk here in that we create food confusion for people, more food confusion than already exists. You know, you walk into the grocery store and you're inundated with messages, and oftentimes that's people's reference to where their food comes from because they're not connected to a farm and they're not a farmer and that kind of thing. So it is much more complex than slapping a label on something. And I think at the surface, it's really easy to say, I want transparency, I want to know. But when you think about, I'm going to have to pay for that because it's going to make my food cost more. And you think about state-by-state labeling and some of the challenges that brings, it's much more complex of an issue than it looks like on the surface. And I think we have viable options today, honestly, for people who say they don't want, you know, GMO for life, is what they say.
Yeah. And David, have you bumped into any organized anti-GMO resistance in your writing?
Oh, the hate mail I got, 0. Really? Yeah, actually, I guess maybe I'm just not notable enough, but I really don't get a lot of direct pushback. Although the Vegan Fest I just tabled this weekend, it's a small fest. You know, tables are you know, not very expensive, but enough that you got pay for them. But there are 3 anti-GMO tables there. The biggest display at the Vegan Fest. So why are the 3 GMO tables, anti-GMO tables there? Where are they getting their funds for that? And what are they doing at Vegan Fest? So I see them. Yeah, in my vegan community, kind of co-opting our cause.
Okay. Andrew, any?
I wouldn't point to one specific individual or group in particular, but CommonGround in general can be, viewed as an industry front group. You know, they assume automatically that we're getting funding from Monsanto and from DuPont and others, which is very much not the case. It's the only funding that is part of our checkoffs, and we as farmers pay into that. So it's a farmer-funded program that we volunteer for. So I think there's also skepticism on the other side. You know, you're talking about where their funding comes from. I see it from the other perspective, where they're saying, well, who's funding you and whose side are you on? So I think they're very quick to point out that you must just be for Monsanto, or you must just be for DuPont or Syngenta or whomever. So I think that argument happens on both sides.
I think they'll look at the behaviors of both sides here, and that's where the difference comes in. The number one funder, by the way, of the non-GMO project is a major nutraceutical and organic food company. There's several funders there. Look at the website of Whole Foods, okay, and go and do a search on their site for the word GMO. You're going to get over 10,000 hits. Now search GMO and cancer, and you're going to get hundreds of hits. And you're going to see posts for bloggers that they allow to post on their site. Now, we need to get these cancer-causing GMOs out of our food supply. That's a pretty irresponsible start statement. You don't see that on DuPont, Monsanto, or Syngenta's websites. You don't see them saying, oh, let's get the evil organic. They don't have that conversation. So I think, yes, so there's money and interest funding groups like this to come and have conversations and shine some light on some things and bring scientists and bring farmers and bring other perspectives. It's a stark difference in what we see coming out of the other side. And again, I think that's just not really been well discussed or exposed, quite frankly.
Why not? What do you think they get away with that?
It's not politically correct. It's that the thing of silence. I make this statement, believe me, it's already going to be out there. Monsanto shill, evil CIA spy, you name it, I've been called it. Running this, I'm a disinformation service, person in some manner or shape. I'm sure it's already being tweeted now. It makes people not want to participate. And journalists also, they're not as interested in telling those stories. And some do, but it doesn't get you very far. It gets you a lot of hate mail.
It was interesting in that PNAS study where they showed that we're cold, but trusted, but cold. It also said that the public was particularly distrustful of scientists who were seeking research funding. And I guess as a public sector scientist, if I'm not seeking research funding, I'm probably not a very good public sector scientist.
And probably won't be a public sector scientist too much longer.
No, because I won't get tenure. And so I think there seems to be this conflation between seeking research funding, because that's actually how we do public-based science, especially as the research budgets of universities have shrunk, and moneyed interests coming, I don't know, from a company to test a product or something, and just a basic, no understanding of how science gets done, and that you actually do have to get research funding in order to actually do real science. And if you're trusting a scientist who's not seeking research funding, I would wonder where their funds are coming from, because by definition, they're not getting peer-reviewed publications and going through a typical process. So I think there's a real misunderstanding there of how science gets done and the need to get those funds.
Now, in the science sector, has that kind of pushback, has that kind of lack of trust from the, we're going to call it the consumer level, has that changed the way that scientists go about seeking research funding? I mean, do scientists know that? And has it harmed the industry at all?
I mean, public sector scientists, I'll take myself for example, I put every research grant I get on my website just to be very transparent about it all. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that if I was to do an industry project, that would be seen as a conflict, and so to not take money from industry. And at some level, that eventually kind of, with research funding going down, it precludes that alliance from ever getting formed or from ever happening. You are going to have less research getting done at some stage, or else you'll just totally get research funding and just go ahead and never speak in public again because you'll be called an industry shill. And I know a friend of mine at the University of Berkeley, she got a $1,000, well, I guess kind of like here today, I got a prize for, and DuPont sponsored it. And I've seen on the internet already that there's this conflation that somehow DuPont is funding the work I'm doing because I happen to win this prize. And so there seems to be this automatic assumption that any little thing is you can never speak again because now you're an industry shill kind of a deal. And it's, I think it's concerning because there are many different sources of funding, and just because you might happen to get a prize or do a project for a company doesn't affect your integrity as a public sector scientist. And this suggestion that now you're going to lie, I find kind of offensive.
Has there been any rebuttal of that mindset by the scientific community in general? Have you noticed any people coming out and say, "Look, I was funded, I got the DuPont prize, but I'm still."
Yeah, I think you can say that, but it still goes on the internet as being,
okay.
It's hard to.
There's been papers about it. People have done, but it doesn't go very far. And what you have to realize is, being a science communicator, communicating in the context of propaganda, which is what the other side is doing. They're held to different standards, and they don't necessarily mesh. We have to break out of this propaganda and black marketing element of disparaging, whether it's biotech or other conventional methods, whatever, so that you can have a conversation that the vast majority of people in the middle actually want to hear. And that's really the challenge. Scientists can't and shouldn't engage in propaganda. And scientists like Alison are really excellent science communicators, as evidenced by her even being here today. But as you said, many scientists don't want to, because they're not communicating in an open, fair playing field. They're communicating in a staged, set of propaganda and marketing elements that the moment you say anything, you're immediately attacked as a Monsanto shill, and you step away from it.
Thanks, Jay. As I started learning more about critical thinking, I really got to appreciate expertise. You know, and I think it's a shame that scientists are burdened with the obligation to become expert communicators on top of being a scientist. Like, I want expertise to be, I want experts to be experts, right? I want scientists to be the best scientists they can be, and it would be great to be awesome communicators too. We've seen an example of that, but it's really tough. You know, like not every scientist can do that, and I don't think they should be expected. Although maybe there's some way we can, you know, fill that gap or whatever. But
people like Alison have day jobs, and you know, so when someone agrees to do Dr. Oz and stuff, which they've got to prepare and train. The other two people that were on Dr. Oz, 3 people that day, Jeffrey Smith, he's a professional storyteller. I mean, that's what that guy's job is. He's not a scientist, has no background in science. We won't go into the details, look him up. And Gary Hirschberg, he's a professional marketer and storyteller. This is what these guys do every single day of the week. And then when we put the scientists in the same context with them, it's often an unfair fight.
They've got a home field advantage, so to speak, being it's their instinct.
But
now,
I think as an industry, our first inclination is to put it on the backs of science, because that's what we know as fact, that's what we believe. But that's not necessarily how you relate to consumers. That's not how you relate to people who are making those decisions. So absolutely the science is critical, but we have to learn from those people who are doing that, and we have to become better storytellers. And we have to play to the emotion of it, and we have to get at the heart of their cares and concerns, because spouting science at them they're so busy and there's so much noise that I don't think it's going to register with them to the point that it probably should, or we would hope that they would. So, I don't think it's your sole responsibility. I think we all need to learn and perhaps take a page out of their playbook, because they are so effective at what they do.
Now, that being said, Julie, I mean, that's what you do as a volunteer with CommonGround. Could you share some meaningful stories where you've been able to connect the GMO side with their personal concerns?
Yeah, so we had a group of bloggers, like I mentioned, out at our farm last week, and they were with us for a couple hours, and harvest is an awesome time to see the farm, and so they love to, see the family and see what we do on our farm. And after a couple hours, we went to lunch, and one of the bloggers pulled me aside and she said, "Gosh, I just want to give you a hug. I love you guys. I love what you do. I can tell that it's in your blood. I love the generational stories. I love all about this." So we were clearly playing to her emotion. I mean, we were telling our story, but we were telling it in a way that she could relate to. But the next sentence out of her mouth was, "I feel so torn. I don't know who to believe." And she said, she's an influential blogger, so she also goes on the organic tours where they take her to organic farms and they see much of the same that they had seen on our farm. And, I stopped and I said, I don't, first of all, it's marketing, and it's really effective marketing that's making you feel torn. They're farmers just like we're farmers. They're facing the same challenges that we're facing. They got weather pressures, they got market pressures. We are more alike than we are different. And this pitting farmers against each other and this battle is really created through marketing. And I'm glad that there are choices, and if she chooses to buy organic, then go ahead and buy organic, but understand what we're doing and understand that there are people behind it. So that's just one example where we try to put a face to what we're doing to conventional agriculture, to people who are growing GMOs on their farm. But it's clear that she's still feeling this tug of war that marketing and food marketing has created.
It has to be either or.
Right.
It can't be
right.
both.
It's not an and in her mind,
Right.
or wasn't being presented to her as an and.
Certainly. Now, and that kind of leads us right into this next question we've got. When we're talking about relating to the public, trying to explain GMOs to the public, the question is, the greatest demand for food in the future is in developing countries. Don't we have a responsibility to use the best science can offer to address this challenge, and can this shape the debate? What have you guys found? The notion that feeding the world, does that resonate with consumers?
It's an important piece of our story, I think, but it's not the lead.
Okay.
In developed markets, that message has been tested, put out, and people don't really believe it, they don't really understand it, but it also doesn't mean something directly to them. So, you're really actually into what I think Julie was saying, you have to show people you have empathy and relationship to them, and that you have something in common first. Then they'll listen to you on these other things.
Dave, I saw you shaking your head emphatically. You were saying no. As he was talking, you were
great.
You were great, right? In your experience, the idea of feeding the world, even amongst
feeding the world, nobody believes that. I mean, at least they just think that's like an industry talking point.
Okay.
They don't trust the corporations making money off of GMOs, and that feeding the world is much more complicated than just making more food, which is not just about GMOs. It's more complicated than that, but they don't understand that.
Okay.
And at the same time that we're talking about feeding the world, we also see an obesity epidemic. So I think most Americans look around and see that and say, I'm not seeing a shortage of food here. So I think it's an interesting dynamic when we try to tell that story.
It's even less relevant to us in America.
I think so.
Certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, GMOs, as they currently exist, are mostly herbicide resistant and insect resistant. And there are so many other opportunities where they actually could play a role in feeding the world that never get discussed because we're so busy with the current model. And I hate to say it, but I've heard people say to me, I'm sick of that save the world argument. It's a pretty cold statement, but it doesn't affect me, kind of thing. It's kind of where that's coming from, I think.
All right. Well, now this next question, Alison, I think you're kind of an expert in.
Okay.
Having just recently participated in one, the question is, should we have public debates with anti-GMO people? And what are the pitfalls? What was your experience going on Oz and addressing it, and then what was the response afterwards?
The experience was fairly tense. So there was, as was mentioned earlier, there were the groups that were being interviewed by Oz were not necessarily scientific experts in that regard and had a very vested interest. And I think, to be frank, that Oz also was interested in, and has been evidenced by recent shows he's put on GMs, where he's interviewed a woman who suggested it was causing autism in her child. And that really frustrates me as a mother when you're suggesting that something like that's such a terrifying concept to a mother to think that feeding GMs is going to cause autism. But the difficulty, I think, to your point, is that you're somewhat constrained by the truth as a scientist. And if you're having a discussion with someone who's not, it makes it a kind of an unfair discussion point, I guess. And so, what was the response afterwards? I mean, we did the best that we could. Of course, they have edit rights on what actually gets in there, and so I think there were plenty of quotes that Martina said that were excellent, that never made the cutting, never made it, and so there's that in there as well. You take a risk when you go on those types of shows, but when we were going through discussing whether we should go on it or not, the risk of not showing up is there's nobody there to talk about the science. And so, I mean, I do give him credit. He did try to get scientists on the show and let us have an opportunity to defend the science. And so I guess that's all you can ask for. And recent shows, that hasn't been the case. It's pretty much been a one-sided discussion.
But as a direct result of Alison and Martina going on the show, and the other academics that have been asked and involved, who after the show came out, sent very strong letters publicly to Oz, to Oprah Winfrey, who owns the Oz show, detailing, here are all the things that you did that were unethical, that were false and misleading, and all of this sort of stuff, which then led actually to Michael Spector writing a profile on Dr. Oz in the New Yorker, which was extremely damaging in terms of pointing out all of his sort of flaws, which then led to Senate hearings just this last summer. I mean, there was a whole series of things that took place that, Dr. Oz is still there. He's still got his 4 million audience, but I think his credibility has now significantly been altered, and you don't find him being quoted as much in mainstream anymore. So he may still, he just did his latest show on GMOs, it was pretty negative. He's apparently still going to do this. It sells TV for him. But he's become significantly less effective because the academic community has held light up to his claims and his tactics.
So the idea that these public debates with anti-GMO people, even those that aren't constrained by the truth, it's still worth our time as an industry, as academics, in support of this technology. Do you agree?
It can be.
Can be. Julie, I saw you nodding there.
I think it's important to engage in a conversation with people who want to have a conversation. People who are so steeped in their beliefs that aren't open to
The first time in California, honestly, we didn't do a very good job at helping with public awareness. It was a political campaign. The resources were directed at specific types of things that really didn't elevate the public's understanding of what we're talking about here today. And so the advocacy side and the organic industry that's funding these labeling initiatives, because it just keeps fomenting this, there may be something wrong, so maybe I should go buy this other stuff, is going to keep doing it until we find a solution. One of those solutions is probably going to be some federal mandated form of voluntary labeling and allowing people to market non-GMO in a truthful, non-misleading manner. Things like that. I also suspect we're going to see a lot of litigation. And so we're going to see this in the courts for a while.
All right. So be prepared to be an expert witness. I suppose would be good advice for all of us.
You know, what really frustrates me is all the money that both sides have spent hasn't educated anybody. And you know, what we could have done in terms of education so that those people at least could, on Jimmy Fallon, could at least answer, oh, it means it's been made using genetic engineering. You know, it's just kind of a waste. Frustrating.
Now that being said, we're coming close to the end here, so let's get some final thoughts on just that point. And it's not a very exciting point or uplifting point to think about. Billions of dollars has been spent, yet we might not be any better off today in terms of general consumer awareness than we were 5 years ago. What is the best path forward? And I'm asking you guys to think a big answer on a tiny little piece of time. Can we change that? Can we have a meaningful impact going forward, given what we've spent so far? Jake?
Yes, and we are. And also realize that, you know, the public attention around these issues is, this is going to sound bad, but it's somewhat limited. You know, we're going to get issues fatigue. This is actually a good opportunity to embrace their concerns, have the conversations, be willing to be online, so that, because again, you're not going to convince someone who's already on the other side, but there's thousands of lurkers and people listening. And forming opinions, not beliefs yet, but that maybe something's not so bad, and I might not have to worry about it. And I would say, you know, we're going to start to see them move, the campaigns moving to other things in the next maybe, you know, 3 to 5 years. Now, that still means we have to keep up the fight, and we need to enlist more academics, farmers, third parties, industry representatives, and all are not going to carry the day.
Yeah, I guess it kind of concerns me involving more academics. As you mentioned, we do have a day job, and we're kind of going up against a very well-funded group whose entire job is selling that story. And you know, the thought of having to deal with that Twitter thing all the time, you know, it's just it's a little bit concerning that there's not, I guess, dedicated people to address this rather than doing it in your spare time. And it's a little bit of an uneven debate at the current time, I think, because there's people very solidly opposed to it. There's academics who are just, well, this is what the facts say, but they're not necessarily going to advocate for it. And then who's left in the space advocating for it? And you know, pretty much the companies get shut down because of all their vested interest. Okay, so farmers, you know, and you guys have day jobs too, I hear. And so, especially this time of year. I think that's been some of the some of the problem, and also just adoption of social media has been slow because we're old, and you know, Twitter doesn't come naturally to someone with, you know, that's a little bit older, and the younger generation, I think, is all over that like a rash. And we don't necessarily have younger people that are wanting to get out there and push a pro message, because probably they're not even working yet, and they don't really even have an interest.
Right. They're disconnected.
So I think there's just been an absence of the voice saying something positive about the technology in the social media space.
Dave, as you look to the future, and especially as you're kind of the lone voice in the wilderness in your community, what does the next couple of years look like from your standpoint?
Well, I do see industry kind of reaching out. I see websites like GMO answers going up. And even though many won't, when I link to articles on that site, they say, well, that's funded openly. They're very honest how they're funded. And my response is kind of like, well, good. It's online. Like, you just prove them wrong. I mean, they're proving a lie. They're admitting that's their answer up there. Like, go for it. Take your best shot. I haven't. The GMO answers thing, I think, is doing pretty good. I mean, I don't know. I don't have data on that, but my side.
You've used it as a resource.
Yeah, and then the scientists are all. There's a whole wide range of scientists on there and everything. From the vegan GMO thing, I'm trying to just hold down my niche in the woods here, kind of thing. Like, I'm using their language to try to reach out to them. And maybe we need more. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, who's going to do this? I'm doing this on my spare time, and because I'm a nerd about this thing. So we're going to find other nerds who can just do this on their spare time, and you get paid for it. Also, you're a shill. So it's a catch-22.
Right. Definitely an issue that the GMO side is we can't have a professional advocator without them being shills. So, Julie, next 5 years, 3 to 5 years, what is your side look like?
Dr. Byrne, and you mentioned the time being a challenge, and I have some people that turn to me and say, why are you doing this? Why are you blogging? Why are you investing your time? Don't you have work to do on the farm? And the answer is yes, but we're fortunate to be fifth-generation farmers. I have 2 little kids who love farming and everything about it, and I want them to have the opportunity to do it. So if I don't do it, that means somebody else has to do it, and hopefully I can do it with a bunch of people to do it. Hopefully it doesn't take the billions of dollars like you described. I think social media provides us a huge opportunity and multiple platforms to reach people that we would have never reached otherwise, and to actually engage with them. So I think it's small things like that we can do to kind of chip away at it. And then the final thing I'd say is I think as an industry we're getting better at working together toward this, but I think for a long time we were really fractured in this organization was doing this and this association was doing that, and we weren't even necessarily talking to each other, and a lot of times it was the same groups funding and on these multiple committees and multiple organizations, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me as a farmer. I wish we would all band together and say, we might have minor differences, and I think USFRA is a step in the right direction in that regard, but I think there's more that we can do. I think some of the reason that some of these groups that oppose us are so incredibly effective is they band together. They have a single, simple message that's based on emotion, and they're all saying the same thing. So, I hope we can continue to make progress in that area, and I think that's where we'll make the biggest headway.
All right. Well, Julie Kenney, I'm sorry. Dave Sutherland, Dr. Eenennaam. I'm just having a terrible time up here. I need more coffee. I need more chemicals is what I need. And Jay Byrne, thank you guys for taking the time to be with us this morning. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. For your questions and your participation here today. As we look out over the rest of this week, there's a lot going on. Obviously, these issues are going to come into play more and more, especially on a week like this that highlights this technology. So please be aware, be ready to communicate. Let's try to unify, right? And let's get more scientists involved and teach them how to talk. Because Alison, you do a great job. On behalf of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, I want to thank you all for taking the time to sit with us here this morning and have this discussion. I hope you found it was time well spent. I hope you picked up a few things that as you go back to wherever in the country or in the world that you call home, there are some things you can take back with you. And if you're on Twitter, all of those hands that went up, you can find U.S. Farmers and Ranchers at USFRA, and or you can find this panel discussion if you want to share it with any friends and family at www.fooddialogues.com. It'll probably be up soon, next couple days. So be sure to check that out. And with that, I hope you have a tremendous time here at the World Food Prize. I hope you enjoy Des Moines. Very proud to be an Iowan. And thank you guys for listening.
Similarly, on behalf of CAST, thank you all for attending today. Watch our website, www.cast-science.org, because soon we'll have the 2015 nomination materials there. So be thinking about who among your colleagues is also passionate about agricultural communication, and next year they could be sitting here with us. So enjoy your day, as we've heard, and thank you all for coming. Bye now.